My name is Maren Holloway, and I'm 34 years old. 7 years ago, my parents looked at my 6-year-old autistic son and decided he was the thing ruining our family. Not the bills. Not their pride. Not the way my mother cared more about whispers in church than the little boy sitting on her living room rug, lining up pieces of blue yarn from darkest to lightest. Him. Rowan. My father called him a lifelong responsibility, the kind no young woman should be forced to carry. My mother used a softer word at first. Special. Then difficult. Then disruptive. By the end of that night, she stopped dressing it up. She called my son a burden. They gave me a choice at their kitchen table in Amarillo. Sign the paperwork for a residential program they had already contacted behind my back, or leave the family with nothing. No house, no insurance help, no monthly support, no safety net. I remember looking through the doorway and seeing Rowan press a green thread flat against his knee, smoothing it over and over with 2 fingers. He had no idea 3 adults were deciding whether he still belonged in his own life. I chose my son. 21 days later, my father changed the locks on the little house we had been renting from him. My mother told everyone at First Grace Chapel that I had taken Rowan away out of bitterness and pride. For 7 years, they played grieving grandparents for anyone willing to listen. Then, last spring, a rug Rowan wove by hand sold at a private Santa Fe auction for $4.1 million. 3 months after that, my parents came back with a lawyer, a polished letter, and a brand new word for the boy they once wanted gone. Gifted. They said they only wanted what was best for him. They said family should help manage a blessing that large. What they did not know was that the rug they wanted a share of had been woven from everything they refused to open. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 50%, comment 1. If it is below 38%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. The part my parents never understood was that Rowan did not become different in the doctor's office. He walked in as my son and walked out as my son. The only thing that changed was the language adults started using around him. It was September of 2018 when the specialist said autism. She said it gently, with a folder in her lap, and a voice trained not to frighten young mothers. She talked about early intervention, sensory supports, speech therapy, routines, strengths. I nodded like I understood all of it. I didn't. I was 27, sitting in a beige office with a fish tank humming against one wall, trying to memorize words I had never expected to need. Rowan was on the floor beside my chair, sorting colored craft sticks into rows: red, orange, yellow, green, blue. Then again, but from shortest to longest. Nothing about him looked broken to me. He was still the boy who covered his ears when shopping carts slammed together. Still the boy who knew which aisle of the library had the soft carpet. Still, the boy who touched my wrist instead of saying help when the world got too loud. On the drive home, I cried quietly at a red light, not because I was ashamed of him, but because I was scared of how much I did not know yet. My mother made it about shame before she made it about anything else. Claudia Whitcomb stood in my parents' kitchen with one hand on the marble counter and said, "What are people going to think?" Not, "What does Rowan need?" Not, "How can we help, people?" That was always the first room my mother entered, the one filled with church women, neighbors, clients, cousins, and whispers she could not control. In my mother's world, pity was almost as dangerous as scandal. Richard, my father, was quieter. He took the folder from my hand and turned straight to the page with projected therapy costs. He ran his finger down the numbers the way he reviewed insurance claims at his office, not cruel enough to sound cruel, just final enough to close the file. "This is not sustainable," he said. Rowan was in the breakfast nook, lining the wooden sticks from shortest to longest, completely unaware that my parents were already measuring his life in costs. My mother lowered her voice anyway, as if he were the embarrassing part of the room. "You are still young, Maren," she said. "There are professionals for children like him." Children like him. That was the first time I heard the door closing. Not all the way, not yet, just enough for me to feel the draft. I did not understand then how carefully my parents had already moved from concern into planning. I thought we were still talking about support, about appointments, schedules, and the kind of fear a family could survive if they loved each other honestly. 3 nights later, my mother called and asked me to come by after dinner. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. She said my father had looked into options, and they wanted to discuss them without upsetting Rowan. I should have heard the warning in that word. Options. People use it when they have already chosen for you. The folder was waiting on the kitchen table when I arrived. Pale blue, with a silver paper clip holding the corners too neatly together. My father sat at one end of the table with his reading glasses low on his nose. My mother stood beside the sink, drying a clean glass that did not need drying. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody asked how Rowan had slept, or whether the new headphones helped at the grocery store. My mother tapped the folder once with 2 fingers and said, "Clearwell has an excellent reputation," as if she were recommending a boarding school instead of a place to send my son away. At first, I thought Clearwell was another therapy clinic. Then I opened the folder and saw the words Residential Behavioral Program printed across the top. There were intake forms already filled in with Rowan's name, his birth date, my address, and his diagnosis. My hands went cold before my mind caught up. "You contacted them?" I asked. My father did not look ashamed. He looked inconvenienced, as if I had noticed the wrong part of a practical solution. "We made an inquiry," he said. "That is not the same thing." My mother sat across from me and folded her hands the way she did before church committee meetings. "Maren, there are families who understand when love is not enough." She said it softly, which somehow made it worse. "At 27, she said, I had not ruined my life yet. That was the word she almost used. Yet. I could still marry. I could still have stability. I could still have more children someday. If that was what God wanted for me." I remember staring at her mouth while she spoke, because the words sounded too polished to have been made in that moment. She had rehearsed them, maybe in the mirror, maybe in prayer. Through the doorway, I could see Rowan on the living room rug, lining up the tassels of a throw blanket and smoothing each one flat before moving to the next. He was 6 years old. He had missing front teeth and a dinosaur sticker on his sock. My father slid another paper toward me. It was a notice for the little house we rented from him, the one he had always called family help. "If you refuse," he said, "you will have 21 days to vacate." Then my mother said the sentence that split my life in 2. "You can be our daughter, or you can keep dragging that burden behind you. You cannot do both." I looked at the pen beside the forms. Then I looked at my son, still making order out of something nobody else even noticed. I did not yell. I did not cry. I pushed the folder back across the table and stood up slowly enough that my knees would not shake. "Then I'm taking my son home," I said. My mother closed her eyes like I had disappointed God himself. My father gathered the papers, aligning the edges with his thumb, the same way he closed files at work when a policy did not cover the damage. By the time I buckled Rowan into his car seat, I understood they had not asked me to choose. They had asked me to surrender, and I had refused. My father waited exactly 8 days before he turned the key that used to open our front door into a weapon. I know because I had written the date on the calendar taped to our refrigerator, circled in blue beside Rowan's therapy appointment and the library story hour I was supposed to lead. 8 days after the kitchen table, I came home from work and found a white envelope tucked under the door. Not mailed. Delivered by hand. Richard Whitcomb had always liked things personal when he wanted them to hurt. Inside was a formal notice ending our rental arrangement. 21 days, just like he promised. No explanation beyond the language required to make it legal. I stood in the entryway with Rowan's backpack still on my shoulder and read it twice while he sat on the floor, taking off his shoes in the wrong order, left first, then right, which meant he was already close to overload. He looked up at me and said, "Home?" I folded the notice once, then again, and said, "For tonight, yes." The house had never been much. 2 bedrooms, a porch that leaned, a kitchen window that stuck when it rained. But it had been predictable, and predictable was not small in Rowan's world. He knew the sound of the heater before it clicked on. He knew which floorboard near the hallway would squeak. He knew the closet where we kept the weighted blanket. My father did not take a luxury from us. He took the map my son used to feel safe. The insurance card stopped working 4 days later. I found out at the pharmacy when the woman behind the counter scanned it, frowned, and tried again. The secondary coverage had been canceled. The prescription was still available, she said. But the price had changed. $276. I had 93 in checking. I paid for half, and asked if the rest could wait until Friday. Then I sat in the car with both hands locked around the steering wheel, wanting to call my mother. That was the stupid human part of me. I did not call. Claudia was already calling everyone else. I learned that 2 Sundays later, from a woman at First Grace Chapel, who texted me a Bible verse and a sentence that made me sit down on the edge of Rowan's bed. "Your mother says you need space, but we're praying you soften your heart." So that was the story. I had not been pushed out, I had withdrawn. They had not tried to send Rowan away. I had denied them access. My mother had turned abandonment into grief before I had even finished packing boxes. By the time we left Amarillo, Claudia had become the grandmother with empty arms, and I had become the unstable daughter too proud to accept help. Richard said almost nothing publicly, which made him look dignified. That was his gift. He could stand beside a lie without touching it and still help it walk. People believed my mother because she cried in the right rooms. I was too busy sorting therapy records, cheap moving boxes, and my son's sensory toys to defend myself against a performance I had not been invited to watch. We drove to Albuquerque in a borrowed hatchback, with 3 suitcases, 2 plastic bins, Rowan's blue headphones, and the small tabletop loom I had bought for $5 at a library fundraiser. The apartment I could afford was behind a dry cleaner, up a narrow staircase that smelled like steam and chemical lavender. The first night, Rowan pressed his palms over his ears every time the machines below us thumped through the floor. I lay beside him on a mattress without sheets and counted with him until his breathing slowed. For a long time, that was our life. Count, adjust, try again. I worked the children's desk at the library and took cataloging jobs after Rowan slept. I learned which grocery store had dimmer lights, which bus driver waited for him to sit before pulling away, which socks had seams he could tolerate. None of it looked heroic. Most of it looked like being tired in public. But every night, when I locked the apartment door and saw Rowan's loom on the milk crate by the window, I reminded myself that we had not been thrown away. We had been moved somewhere my parents could no longer reach without showing their hands. The first winter in Albuquerque taught me that grief could become routine if you had enough bills to pay. I stopped checking my phone for messages from my parents. I stopped expecting an apology to arrive between library shifts and pharmacy receipts. Rowan and I built our days out of small predictable things: the same bus stop, the same corner table after school, the same quiet walk home when the traffic lights changed. And at night, when the building finally settled, he carried that $5 loom from room to room like it was something alive. The first piece he made for my mother was not really a rug. It was a small square of woven yarn, uneven at the edges, blue and cream with one crooked yellow line running through the middle. He worked on it for nearly 3 weeks, pulling the thread through with a focus so complete that I sometimes forgot to breathe while watching him. When he finished, he held it flat in both hands and said, "For Grandma's table." Not a question, not a hope exactly, more like an instruction he trusted the world to follow. I should have protected him from that kind of trust. That is one of the sentences I still carry. But he was 7, and some weak, stubborn part of me still believed a grandmother could not refuse something made by a child's hands. So I wrapped the little square in brown paper, wrote my parents' address in Amarillo, and let Rowan press the stamps onto the corner. He pushed each one down carefully with his thumb, making sure the edges stuck. At the post office, he watched the package slide away behind the counter, like he had sent a piece of himself ahead of us. It came back 11 days later. I found it in our apartment mailbox, wedged between a grocery flyer and an overdue utility notice. The brown paper was bent at one corner. Across the front, in red block letters, were the words I would come to hate more than almost any others. Refused. Return to sender. I stood in the narrow hallway, with the metal mailboxes rattling behind me, and felt something inside me go very still. Rowan was beside me, holding the mailbox key on its plastic tag. He looked at the stamp for a long time. "The mail got tired?" he asked. I said yes. That was my first lie about them. It was small, and it was gentle, and it still tasted like metal in my mouth. I told myself I was buying him time. I told myself children did not need every truth the moment adults made it ugly. But the next year, he made another one, this time green and white, with 2 careful knots at the bottom. "For Grandpa's chair," he said. I sent it because I did not know how to take the wanting out of him without breaking something worse. That one came back, too. So did the birthday strip with orange thread. So did the Easter piece he made, because someone at the library said families mailed things on holidays. Every returned package had the same red mark. Refused. Some were unopened. Some had the corners crushed. One had my mother's handwriting across the back in blue ink. "Do not deliver again." As if love could be declined with 4 words and a pen. I began keeping them in a wooden thread box under my bed. At first, I kept them because I could not bear to throw them away. Later, I kept them because throwing them away felt like becoming the second person to reject what my son had tried to give. By the time Rowan turned 11, the box was heavier than it looked. One Saturday afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the kitchen, he found it. I came back to the bedroom and saw him sitting on the floor with the packages arranged around him by year. He did not cry. That was the part that frightened me. He touched each red stamp with one finger, then looked up at me with a calm I did not know what to do with. "They got there," he said. I sat down slowly on the carpet. He touched the first package, the blue and cream square for my mother's table. "They got there," he said again. Then he looked at the others, all those years of returned thread, and finished the thought I had been too cowardly to say out loud. "They just didn't open them." For a while after that, Rowan stopped making pieces for other people. He still worked the loom every night, but the work changed. Before, his colors had been small and bright, little offerings meant to travel. After he found the box, the colors deepened. He began leaving spaces in the weave, narrow white gaps that looked accidental, until you saw how carefully he repeated them. When I asked what they were, he did not answer right away. Rowan never rushed language just because someone else was uncomfortable waiting for it. The answer came 3 hours later while I was washing a pot in the sink. "Those are the places that did not hold," he said from the table. Then he went back to tying knots. As if he had not just handed me a sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. That was how Rowan spoke, when words were too small. He put them into wool first, then gave me the translation only if he trusted the room enough to hear it. I met June Calder, because a librarian named Mrs. Alvarez saw one of Rowan's woven strips tucked inside his backpack and asked who had taught him. When I told her nobody really had, she wrote an address on the back of a checkout receipt. "Take him here," she said. The place was a community arts room in Santa Fe, 2 hours away, and we went on Saturday mornings when my library schedule allowed it and when I could afford the gas. I almost turned around before we went inside. I was tired of rooms where people assessed my son. June did not assess him. She watched him. That was different. She was 58 then, with silver hair in one braid, and hands rough from decades of thread, dye, and sun. She set a basket of scrap wool near Rowan, without telling him what to do. He touched nothing for 6 minutes. June waited. Then he chose one blue strand, one brown, one red, and laid them side by side on the table. June looked at the order he had made and said softly, "He isn't making patterns, he's recording pressure." No one had ever described my son that way before. Not as delayed, not as difficult, not as a list of accommodations stapled to a school form, recording pressure. As if the weight he had carried had shape, color, direction. For nearly a year, we made that drive whenever I could manage it. June gave him time on an old floor loom in the corner, and Rowan treated it with the seriousness other boys gave to baseball gloves or bicycles. He learned tension by touch. He learned which threads could be pulled tight, and which ones snapped if you asked too much of them. Months later, June called Hollis Crane, who owned a small textile gallery in Santa Fe. I said no before she finished the sentence. I did not want strangers turning Rowan into a story they could feel good about for 10 minutes. June only nodded and said, "Then we make rules before we open any door." Hollis agreed to all of them. No photographs of Rowan's face. No miracle language. No selling his diagnosis. The work would speak first. My son would not be placed on display beside it. His first piece hung on a side wall, not under a spotlight, not with a speech. People still stopped. They stood in front of it longer than I expected, quiet in the way people get when something private has found them without asking permission. Rowan watched from a back room, with his headphones on, one hand resting on the wooden frame of his loom. Nobody knew about the returned packages. Nobody knew about Clearwell or the kitchen table. They only knew that the cloth made them feel something they could not name yet. That was the beginning. The beginning did not feel like success. It felt like standing very still while a door opened in a house I had never expected to enter. Hollis moved Rowan's work from the side wall to a private textile showing the following spring, not because she wanted spectacle, but because people had started asking for his name in rooms where collectors spoke softly and wrote numbers on cards. Rowan did not care about any of that. He cared that the rug hung straight, that the bottom edge did not curl, and that nobody touched the fibers with wet hands. The piece was called Returned Thread. It was larger than anything he had made before, wide enough that June and I had to help roll it in muslin when we brought it to the gallery. From a distance, it looked almost simple. Bands of cream, brown, blue, and red, crossing each other with strange restraint. Up close, you could see the interruptions. Small white spaces, where the weave opened and held itself apart. Red lines that repeated like marks on a package. One blue thread running through the whole thing, uneven but unbroken. The night of the private showing, Rowan wore the gray button-down he could tolerate for exactly 90 minutes. I knew because we had practiced at home. June stood near the doorway. Hollis kept the room quiet. No speeches, no photographs, no one reaching for him with pity in their eyes. People came to look at the rug, and then something happened that I still do not know how to describe, without sounding like I am making it prettier than it was. They stopped performing. Collectors, gallery owners, people with shoes worth more than my first car. They stood in front of my son's work, and went quiet. A man named Everett Sloan bought it before the evening ended. I had heard his name only because Hollis had explained that certain collectors could change the weather around an artist's career just by paying attention. When the offer came, I thought I had misunderstood. $4.1 million. I looked at Tessa Monroe, who had already been helping us with contracts by then, and she did not smile. She checked the paperwork first. That was why I trusted her. Rowan looked at the number on the page, then at me, and said, "That is too many numbers." Because Rowan was 13, the money did not come to me. It went into a trust with his name on it, reviewed and documented so cleanly that no one could pretend later that I had touched what was his. I kept copies of every contract, every approval, every bank statement. The money was not mine. It was proof that the world had finally seen something in my son that my parents had refused to open when it arrived in brown paper. 2 weeks after a regional arts magazine ran the story, my mother remembered my phone number. Her voicemail was warm in the way syrup can be warm before you notice the glass underneath it. "Maren, sweetheart, we heard about Rowan's blessing," she said. "Family should be included in blessings." She did not say his name first, she said blessing. That told me everything. My father followed with an email before dinner. "A sum of this size requires mature oversight. 7 years earlier, my son had been a burden. Now, apparently, he was an asset in need of management. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here is a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guessed correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. The letter arrived 9 days after my father's email, in an envelope too thick for ordinary family concern. The paper was cream-colored, the address typed instead of handwritten, with the name Malcolm Price pressed into the corner like a small warning. I stood at the apartment counter and read it, while Rowan worked at his loom in the next room, the wooden frame clicking softly under his hands. My mother had not asked to see him. My father had not asked what he needed. They had gone straight to representation. The language was polished enough to almost hide its teeth. "Claudia and Richard Whitcomb," it said, "were seeking formal recognition of their role as maternal grandparents and requesting a structured conversation regarding the stewardship of Rowan Holloway's recent financial assets." Stewardship. That was the word they had chosen. Not control, not access, not money. Stewardship, as if they were elders guarding a family orchard instead of two people who had refused every small square of thread their grandson had ever sent them. Then came the paragraph that made the room go quiet around me. "Given the child's age and developmental limitations, broader family oversight may better serve his long-term interests." I read that sentence twice, then a third time. They were not only coming for the trust, they were coming for the right to describe my son's mind in a way that made him smaller. The same people who had not learned how Rowan thought now wanted a lawyer to say he could not be trusted with the future his own hands had made. I took the letter to Tessa Monroe the next morning. Her office was on the second floor of an old adobe building near the plaza, with a narrow staircase and a cactus dying quietly in the window. She read every line without interrupting me once. That was something I liked about Tessa. She did not rush outrage. When she finished, she set the pages down and said, "People who lie for years usually forget which version they told first. Let them choose one on record." I wanted to argue anyway. I wanted to print every receipt, every returned package, every therapy bill, every school plan, and mail copies to every person in Amarillo who had ever looked at me like I had stolen a grandchild. But Tessa shook her head. "You do not win this by sounding wounded," she said. "You win it by making sure they sound certain." So we agreed to a meeting. My parents would bring Malcolm, Tessa would be there, a trust representative would observe, and because my parents trusted her, Elaine Porter would be invited as a family witness. Elaine was my father's older sister, a retired nurse with sensible shoes and birthday cards that arrived 3 days early every year. She had never been cruel to me. That made her harder to hate and harder to forgive. For 7 years, she had believed my mother's version because it was easier than imagining Claudia had made the whole thing up. My parents wanted Elaine in that room because they thought she belonged to them. Tessa wanted her there because sometimes a lie needs one honest person nearby when it finally collapses. That night, I spread the clean records across our kitchen table after Rowan went to bed. Trust documents, auction contracts, bank statements, therapy invoices, school notes. Nothing dramatic, just proof that I had guarded what belonged to him. I thought he was asleep until I heard his voice from the hallway. "They are talking about my rug," he said. I turned, and he was standing there in his socks, one hand on the wall. And my mind. I told him he did not have to be part of the meeting. Rowan looked past me at the papers and said, "I have better proof." Rowan went to the bedroom and came back with the wooden thread box in both hands. He carried it carefully, not because it was fragile, but because everything inside it had already been mishandled by other people. He set it on the kitchen table beside the trust documents, and for a moment the room held two kinds of proof. Mine was paper, contracts, invoices, bank statements, the clean language adults use when they want a judge to believe them. His was quieter. Brown wrapping, red stamps, small woven things no one had wanted. I reached for the lid, then stopped. It was not mine to open anymore. Rowan looked at my hand, then at the box. "I know what is in it," he said. "I have known since I was 11. There was no accusation in his voice. That almost made it worse. I had spent years thinking I was protecting him from the full shape of what my parents had done. And there he was, calm and steady, showing me he had been carrying the shape by himself. He took each package out and placed them in order by year. Christmas first, then birthdays, then the Easter strip, then the small green piece he had once made for my father's chair. He lined them up with the same care he gave his threads. After that, he added the Clearwell paperwork, a copy Tessa had gotten from the old file request, and a small drive containing the kitchen recording I had forgotten existed until she asked for everything. "Order helps," Rowan said. Not as an explanation. As a rule, for the next 3 evenings, he sat with the box after dinner. He did not rehearse speeches. He did not ask what my parents might say. He only checked the order, touched each label, and wrote one sentence at a time on index cards he did not show me. I wanted to tell him he did not have to prove anything to people who had already failed him. But then he looked up and said, "They are using the wrong caption." I asked what he meant. He said, "They keep saying they loved me. That is the wrong caption." The night before the meeting, he added one last thing. A cloth label, cut from cream fabric, folded around a piece of stiff paper. His handwriting was on the outside, small and careful. I did not read it. Some things a child makes are not evidence, even when the whole world has taught him to save proof. I only watched him place it on top of the returned packages and close the lid. The next morning, my parents arrived with a lawyer and 7 years of practiced grief. My son arrived with a box of thread. Tessa's conference room was smaller than the kind of room my parents would have chosen. No dark wood paneling, no long table meant to make people feel important. Just 6 chairs, a pitcher of water, a legal pad in front of each seat, and a window looking out over the flat gold light of Santa Fe. Rowan sat beside me with the thread box on his lap, both hands resting on the lid. He had chosen his soft gray shirt and the socks without seams. I had chosen not to speak unless Tessa asked me to. My parents arrived at 10 exactly. My mother came in first, wearing navy and pearls, carrying the sad, careful smile she used at funerals and church luncheons. My father followed with Malcolm Price, who had the polished quiet of a man paid to make greed sound responsible. Elaine came last. She looked at me, then at Rowan, and gave a small uncertain nod. My mother looked around the room and said, "What beautiful light." 7 years. And her first sentence was about the window. She kissed the air near Elaine's cheek. She shook Tessa's hand. She smiled at Malcolm like they had already won. Then her eyes moved over Rowan and did not stop. Not really. She looked at the box on his lap longer than she looked at his face. I felt his shoulder shift beside mine, but he said nothing. Tessa opened the meeting by asking Malcolm to state his client's position clearly for the record. I folded my hands together under the table and let the performance begin. Malcolm started with concern. That was the costume. He spoke of grandparents who had been excluded, of a fractured family, of a vulnerable minor whose sudden financial success required thoughtful adult guidance. He said my parents were not seeking conflict. They were seeking stability. My mother lowered her eyes at that word, as if it had been written for her. When Malcolm paused, she reached into her sleeve for a tissue. I had seen that tissue trick before. She always cried prepared. "We tried," she said. her voice trembling at just the right edges. For years, we tried to be part of his life. Maren made that impossible. She moved him away. She would not answer. She punished us because we disagreed with her choices. Elaine looked down at her lap. My father added only one sentence, but it landed exactly where he meant it to. Maren has always struggled when emotions and responsibility meet. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. Then Malcolm turned a page and said what they had really come to say. No one disputes the child's artistic ability. The question is whether, given his developmental limitations and the size of the assets involved, broader family oversight would serve his best interests. The child. Not Rowan. Not the artist whose work they wanted to manage. The child. Beside me, Rowan lifted the thread box and placed it on the table. The sound was small. Somehow, it ended the room. Rowan opened the box without looking at my mother. He lifted the first package out with both hands and placed it in the center of the table. Brown paper, softened with age. Red stamp across the front. Refused. Returned to sender. Then he placed another beside it. And another. Christmas. Birthday. Easter. Year after year. Laid out in a quiet row between the pitcher of water and Malcolm Price's legal pad. "These are the gifts I sent," Rowan said. His voice was low, but no one asked him to repeat himself. My mother stared at the packages as if they had arrived from a stranger's house. "Mail gets misdirected," she said quickly. "That happens all the time." Rowan did not answer. He took out the green and white piece made for my father's chair and turned it so the ink on the back faced Elaine. "Do not deliver again." My mother's handwriting sat there in blue, plain as a signature. Elaine leaned forward. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. My father looked at the table, not at the package. That was how I knew he recognized it. Then Rowan placed the Clearwell paperwork on top of Malcolm's printed petition draft. The room changed. It was not louder, it was the opposite. The silence became organized. Elaine picked up the first page and read the sentence my mother had written 7 years earlier. "The child is disruptive to the stability and reputation of the family." I watched Elaine's face as the words settled into it. "Claudia," she said, barely above a whisper, "this is your handwriting." My mother reached for the tissue again, but this time, she did not know what expression to put behind it. Tessa did not move until Rowan nodded once. Then she plugged the small drive into her laptop and played the recording. My mother's voice filled the room, younger but unmistakable. "He will drain every decent thing out of your life." Then my father, flat and final. "Then you leave with him. Not with our help." No one spoke after that. There are silences that feel empty, and there are silences that feel like a verdict. This one sat on the table with the packages, the forms, and all the years they had tried to rename. Rowan took the printed photograph of returned thread from the box last. He set it beside the first blue and cream square, the one he had made for his grandmother's table. The colors answered each other. The red marks in the rug matched the refused stamps. The white gaps held the same shape as all the places they had left empty. For the first time that morning, Rowan looked directly at my parents. "The rug you want," he said, touching the old package with 2 fingers, "is made from what you refused." Malcolm closed his folder. Tessa looked at him and said softly, "I think your clients have said enough." A week later, Malcolm Price sent one final letter. This one was thin. No thick envelope, no raised lettering, no careful phrases about stewardship or concern. Just 2 short paragraphs stating that Claudia and Richard Whitcomb were withdrawing their request and would not pursue any further claim regarding Rowan's trust. On paper, the whole thing ended quietly. No courtroom, no judge, no dramatic speech, just ink on a page admitting, without apology, that there was nothing left for them to take. But in Amarillo, quiet did not last. Elaine went home with copies of what she had seen, and for once, she did not protect the easier version of the story. She called my cousin first. Then, one of the women from First Grace Chapel called her. Then someone else. Truth moved through that town the same way my mother's grief had moved years earlier, kitchen to kitchen, pew to pew. Except this time, it carried weight. There were returned packages. There was Clearwell. There was her handwriting. There was my father's voice. My parents did not lose everything. People like them rarely do all at once. They still had their house, their polished manners, their old friends who preferred discomfort over accountability. But they lost the one thing they had guarded harder than money. They lost the story. The grandmother with empty arms became the woman who refused a child's gifts. The quiet, responsible grandfather became the man who stood beside it and called silence dignity. Some people apologized to me, some disappeared. I did not chase either group. I set the boundary in writing because I had learned that spoken boundaries become invitations for debate. No access to Rowan's trust, no authority over his work, no private contact unless Rowan chose it himself. No conversations wrapped in the word family, as if that word could erase 7 years of locked doors. Rowan read the letter once and said, "Good." That was all. For him, the meeting had never been revenge. It had been correction. The caption had been wrong, and now it was not. That summer, Rowan asked June if other kids could use the studio looms on quiet mornings. He wanted part of the trust to fund materials, headphones, soft lights, and a room where no one touched a child's work without asking. Hollis helped set it up. Tessa made sure every dollar stayed clean. Rowan named the program "A Real Chair at the Table." When I asked why, he thought for a long time and said, "Because some chairs should not be empty." The wooden thread box still sits on our shelf. Most of what lived inside it has done its work. There is only one thing I keep folded there now, the cloth label Rowan placed on top the night before the meeting. He gave it to me after we got home, when the door was locked and the world had finally stopped asking him to explain his pain. On it, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "For the woman who kept the loom standing." That was the apology I had waited for from the wrong people. My parents came back when my son had something worth taking. Rowan had known all along who stayed. This story is about the difference between family as a word and family as an action. Maren's parents used the language of love, concern, faith, and responsibility, but their actions showed something else. They rejected Rowan when he was vulnerable, punished Maren for protecting him, and rewrote the truth so they could appear innocent. Years later, when Rowan's rug became valuable, they returned not because they had changed, but because the thing they once called a burden had become something they could profit from. The deepest meaning of the story is that a person's worth does not begin when the world finally recognizes it. Rowan was valuable before the gallery, before the money, before the applause, and before anyone called him gifted. His art did not make him worthy. It only forced others to see what Maren had seen all along. That is why the rug matters so much. It was not just an expensive object. It was a record of pain, rejection, memory, and survival. The lesson I take from this story is that love is proven by who stays when there is nothing to gain. Maren stayed through the bills, the fear, the loneliness, the judgment, and the years when no one believed her. Her parents returned only when there was money on the table. That contrast reveals the truth. Another lesson is that silence is not always neutral. Richard did not always speak the cruelest words, but he allowed them, signed the papers, and benefited from the lie. Silence can become a form of betrayal when it protects cruelty. In the end, the story teaches us to stop begging the wrong people to recognize our value. Sometimes, healing begins when we stop trying to be believed by those who chose not to see us and start building a life with the people who stayed.